It was a warm Saturday afternoon in the heart of suburbia, where the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the sound of children laughing as they played in the park. Marcus had planned this day for weeks, hoping to spend some quality time with his 7-year-old daughter, Emily. They had a tradition. Every other weekend, they'd pick a new spot to explore. Today, it was Maplewood Park, a sprawling area filled with walking trails, a playground, and a sparkling lake that glittered under the sunlight. Emily, with her blonde curls bouncing as she skipped along, clutched a paper bag of birdseed in her tiny hands. Her excitement was infectious, and Marcus couldn't help but smile as he followed her. People often stared when they were out together, but Marcus had grown used to it. A tall black man in his early 30s, with a warm yet commanding presence. He knew that some people couldn't reconcile the sight of him with Emily's pale skin and bright blue eyes. But Marcus never let it bother him. Emily was his world, and that was all that mattered. As they reached the lake, Emily darted ahead, tossing small handfuls of seed to the ducks that eagerly swam toward her. Marcus stayed a few steps behind, keeping a watchful eye while letting her enjoy her independence. He loved how fearless she was, how her curiosity seemed boundless. But today, something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. But the unease lingered like a shadow. Nearby, Karen Jacobs sat on a bench, her designer sunglasses perched on the tip of her nose as she sipped from a to-go cup of herbal tea. A self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood, Karen prided herself on knowing everyone in Maplewood. She had lived there for over a decade and considered it her personal duty to maintain the integrity of the community. So when she spotted Marcus and Emily by the lake, her eyes narrowed. Karen wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, at least that's what she told herself. But something about the way Marcus held himself, his casual stance as he watched Emily, made her suspicious. Was he watching the little girl too intently? Was she even his daughter? The doubts planted themselves in her mind, growing more persistent with each passing second. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen as she debated whether to act. Karen glanced around the park, looking for anyone else who might share her concerns. Parents were scattered across the playground, chatting in groups, but no one seemed to notice what she saw. The child was laughing, carefree, while the man, well, he was too calm, too composed. Her inner alarm bells rang louder. Emily ran back to Marcus, holding out her hands to show him the crumbs left in the bag. "Daddy, the ducks love me," she exclaimed, her face beaming with pure joy. "I told you they would," Marcus replied, crouching to her level and brushing a stray curl from her face. "You've got a way with animals, kiddo." The term daddy stopped Karen cold. She froze mid-sip, her tea suddenly forgotten. That didn't prove anything, she thought. Anyone could make a child say that. And besides, why didn't the girl look anything like him? Karen's chest tightened, her conviction growing. Something wasn't right, and she had to do something before it was too late. Her fingers moved instinctively, dialing 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional as Karen described what she thought she was witnessing. "Yes, I'm at Maplewood Park," she said, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "There's a man here with a little girl, and it doesn't seem right. I think she might be in danger." The dispatcher asked for details, and Karen gave a thorough description of Marcus and Emily, her words laced with assumption and fear. As she ended the call, a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety settled over her. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that it was better to be safe than sorry. Meanwhile, Marcus and Emily had moved to a nearby picnic table to enjoy the sandwiches they had packed. Emily chattered about school and her latest favorite book, while Marcus listened intently, nodding at all the right moments. He loved these conversations, these small glimpses into her world. But his peaceful afternoon was about to shatter. The sound of police sirens cut through the tranquility of the park, growing louder as they approached. Marcus glanced up, his brow furrowing in confusion. What could be happening? He scanned the area, looking for signs of trouble, but everything seemed normal until he noticed two officers walking directly toward him. "Excuse me, sir," one of them said, his tone firm but polite. "We need to ask you a few questions." Marcus felt a sinking sensation in his chest as Emily clung to his arm, her bright eyes clouded with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. "Just a routine check," the officer replied, his gaze shifting to Emily. "Is this your daughter?" Marcus's heart pounded. He could feel the stares of park-goers now, their curiosity turning into judgment. He nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, this is my daughter. Is there a problem?" Before the officer could answer, Karen approached, her expression a mix of triumph and worry. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I just couldn't stay silent. It just didn't look right." Marcus turned to her, his jaw tightening. He understood now. The unease he'd felt earlier had a name, a face. And as Karen's words hung in the air, he knew that this wasn't going to end quickly or quietly. The officers exchanged glances, sensing the tension. One of them pulled out a notepad, ready to dig deeper, while the other tried to keep the situation calm. Emily's small hand tightened around Marcus's, her trust in him unshaken, even as the world around them seemed to spiral out of control. And that's when Marcus decided he wouldn't let this slide. Not this time. The truth was about to come out, and it would leave everyone, including Karen, reeling. Marcus straightened his back and took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm as the officer stood before him. Emily, sensing her father's unease, pressed closer to his side. Her small fingers gripped his hand tighter, her earlier joy replaced with uncertainty. He could feel her trembling, and it broke his heart. The officer with the notepad cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report about a possible, unusual situation here. Would you mind answering a few questions?" His tone was measured, trying to diffuse the tension, but it still carried an air of authority that demanded compliance. Marcus glanced at Emily, his voice low and soothing as he addressed her first. "It's okay, sweetheart. Stay close to me." He then looked up at the officer, his eyes steady but guarded. "What exactly is the concern? We're just here enjoying the park." Karen, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, couldn't keep quiet. "I called," she blurted, her voice wavering between confidence and hesitation. "I saw you two, and it didn't seem, well, normal. She doesn't look like you, and I thought she might be in danger." Marcus felt the sting of her words, like a slap. He let out a slow breath, willing himself to stay composed. This wasn't the first time he'd faced ignorant assumptions about his relationship with Emily, but never had it escalated to this level. He looked at Karen, his expression unreadable. "She's my daughter," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We're family." The second officer, who had remained quiet until now, crouched slightly to Emily's eye level, his voice gentle. "Hi there. What's your name?" Emily hesitated, looking up at Marcus for reassurance. He gave her a small nod, squeezing her hand. "Emily," she said softly. "That's a pretty name," the officer said with a kind smile. "How old are you, Emily?" "7, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded. "And who's this with you?" Emily looked at Marcus as if the question was silly. "My dad," she said, her tone firmer this time, as if daring anyone to question her. Karen's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "She could have been coached to say that," she muttered under her breath, just loud. Enough for Marcus to hear. His patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. "Do you want to see proof?" he asked, his voice tight. I have pictures of us together on my phone. Birth records, custody paperwork. Whatever you need to. Feel comfortable that I'm not some stranger." The officer with the notepad raised a hand. "That won't be necessary right now, sir. Let's just take a moment to understand the situation." Marcus nodded, though frustration simmered just below the surface. He wasn't a stranger to the assumptions people made about him, but Karen's audacity was on another level. She hadn't even given him a chance before jumping to conclusions and involving the police. Emily tugged at his sleeve, her voice small but insistent. "Daddy, why are they asking all these questions? Did we do something bad?" His heart ached at her innocence. "No, baby," he said gently, crouching down to meet her eyes. "We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people make mistakes, and we just have to help them understand." Karen scoffed. "Mistake? I was trying to protect her." Marcus rose to his full height, his gaze locking with Karen's. "Protect her from what? A father who loves her more than anything in the world. You didn't see us laughing together, playing together, sharing our sandwiches? Or did you just see what you wanted to see?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. The officers exchanged glances, clearly aware of the tension but unsure how to proceed. One of them finally spoke, addressing Marcus. "We understand this is upsetting, sir, but we're just trying to ensure everyone's safety. If you have identification or anything that shows your relationship, it would help us clear this up quickly." Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and a laminated card he always kept with him, Emily's school ID, which listed him as her emergency contact. "Here," he said, his voice clipped. "This should clear up any doubts." The officer examined the cards, his expression softening as he handed them back. "Thank you. That's all we needed." He turned to Karen, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, everything checks out. This gentleman is her father." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "But I was just trying to help. How was I supposed to know?" The officer gave her a measured look. "Sometimes it's best to observe a little longer before jumping to conclusions. This could have been handled differently." Marcus didn't wait for Karen to offer any further explanation. He crouched down to Emily again, brushing a tear from her cheek. "How about we head home, kiddo? I think we've had enough excitement for one day." Emily nodded, wrapping her arms around his neck as he lifted her into his arms. She buried her face against his shoulder, seeking the comfort that only he could provide. As they walked away, Marcus felt the weight of the stares from other park-goers. He knew this moment would stay with him, a reminder of the assumptions people made based on appearances. But more than anything, he felt the sting of having his bond with Emily questioned. Karen stood frozen, her mind racing as the reality of what she'd done sank in. She watched Marcus carry Emily away, the love between them unmistakable, and a pang of guilt settled in her chest. She had meant to protect the child, but instead, she had caused harm. Harm that couldn't be undone with a simple apology. And yet, even as Marcus and Emily disappeared from view, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she hadn't understood. As Marcus carried Emily toward the car, he tried to push down the frustration bubbling inside him. He didn't want Emily to feel the weight of his emotions. She was already shaken enough. Instead, he focused on her, humming a soft tune as they reached the parking lot. Her grip around his neck remained firm, a silent plea for comfort. Marcus opened the car door and gently set her in her booster seat. Buckling her in with care, he crouched beside her, his voice calm and steady. "Hey, kiddo, you okay?" Marcus opened the car door and gently set her in her booster seat, buckling her in with care. He crouched beside her, his voice calm and steady. "Hey, kiddo, you okay?" Emily nodded, but avoided his eyes. "Why didn't she believe you were my dad?" she asked, her voice small but heavy with confusion. Marcus sighed, searching for the right words. Sometimes people don't understand things they haven't seen before. You and me, we're not what everyone expects, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. Emily tilted her head, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Is it because you're black and I'm not? Marcus paused. She was so young, yet so perceptive. Yeah, it's a little bit of that, he admitted. Some people think families are supposed to look a certain way, and when they see something different, they get confused. But the important thing is that we know the truth. We're a family, and nothing changes that. Emily nodded again, this time with more confidence. I'm glad you're my dad. Marcus smiled, the warmth of her words cutting through the day's chill. And I'm glad you're my daughter. As they drove home, Marcus couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. It wasn't just Karen's actions, it was the deeper implications. He'd spent years working to build a life where Emily felt safe and loved, but moments like these reminded him how fragile that sense of security could be. When they arrived home, the house felt quieter than usual. Marcus fixed Emily her favorite snack, peanut butter and banana sandwiches, while she settled on the couch with her coloring book. He watched her from the kitchen, marveling at her resilience. She was already immersed in her drawing, her small face scrunched in concentration, as if the day's events had been nothing more than a passing storm. But Marcus couldn't let it go. Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, he sat at the dining table with his laptop. He wanted to understand what had driven Karen to make that call. Was it fear, ignorance, something else entirely? He typed racial bias in parenting into the search bar, diving into articles and stories from families who had faced similar experiences. The stories were all too familiar. Parents questioned at grocery stores, stared at during school pickups, or outright confronted by strangers who couldn't reconcile their assumptions with reality. Each story added to his growing resolve. He wasn't just angry, he was determined. Emily deserved a world where their bond wasn't questioned, where she could grow up without feeling the sting of other people's biases. Meanwhile, Karen sat in her own kitchen, staring at her phone. The call she had made played on a loop in her mind. At the time it had felt like the right thing to do, but now she wasn't so sure. The way Marcus had looked at her, the hurt, the disappointment, it lingered. And then there was Emily. Karen had expected to find a frightened child, but instead she'd seen a little girl who clearly adored her father. Karen poured herself another cup of tea, trying to shake the unease. She wasn't a bad person, she told herself. She had acted out of concern, not malice. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging voice questioning her motives. Was it really about protecting the child, or was it her own discomfort with something she didn't understand? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find her neighbor Lisa standing on the porch. Lisa was one of the few people in the neighborhood Karen actually liked. They often exchanged pleasantries or shared coffee on lazy afternoons. "Hey," Lisa said, her tone casual but curious. "I heard what happened at the park today." Karen's stomach tightened. News traveled fast in their community. "Oh, you did?" she said, trying to keep her voice light. Lisa nodded. "Yeah, a couple of parents were talking about it. I wanted to hear your side." Karen hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I thought the little girl might be in trouble," she said carefully. "The man with her didn't look like her, and I don't know. Something felt off." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "So, you called the cops?" "Karen, do you realize how that must have looked to him, to his daughter?" Karen bristled, defensive. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to help." Lisa crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "Did it ever cross your mind to talk to him first? To ask questions instead of assuming the worst?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Lisa had a point, and it was one Karen didn't want to admit. Back at Marcus's house, the evening passed quietly. He tucked Emily in with her favorite bedtime story, her laughter finally returning as he did all the silly voices she loved. Once she was asleep, he returned to the table, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but he knew he couldn't let the incident fade into the background. This wasn't just about him and Emily. It was about challenging the biases that allowed situations like this to happen in the first place. As the night deepened, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow, he would talk to someone, maybe a lawyer, maybe the local community center. He wanted to make sure no one else had to go through what he and Emily had faced. It was time for action, and he was ready to take the first step. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a sense of determination. He had spent most of the night thinking about what had happened at the park and how it made Emily feel. He couldn't change the past, but he could do something about the future. He wanted to ensure that the next time someone like Karen saw a family that didn't fit their narrow definition of normal, they'd think twice before jumping to conclusions. As he made breakfast, Emily came into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair a messy halo around her face. "Are we going to the park again today?" she asked, climbing onto a chair. Marcus paused, then smiled. "Not today, kiddo. I was thinking we could do something different. Maybe go to the library or check out that art exhibit you've been wanting to see." Emily's face lit up, the one with the big, colorful paintings. "That's the one," Marcus said, ruffling her hair. "But first, we've got some errands to run." After breakfast, Marcus made a few phone calls. He reached out to a community advocacy group he'd read about the night before. The woman on the other end of the line, Denise, listened patiently as he explained what had happened at the park. Her voice was calm but firm as she assured him that his experience was unfortunately not uncommon. She offered to connect him with a local support group for transracial families and suggested they meet later in the week to discuss ways to raise awareness in the community. The call left Marcus feeling both validated and overwhelmed. He wasn't alone in this fight, but it was clear that the road ahead would be challenging. Still, for Emily's sake, he was willing to face it head-on. Meanwhile, Karen couldn't shake her lingering guilt. She had spent the night replaying the incident in her mind, her initial confidence in her actions now eroded by doubt. She hadn't expected the situation to weigh on her so heavily, but the image of Emily clinging to her father's hand haunted her. Karen decided she needed to do something, anything, to make amends, even if she wasn't sure how. That afternoon, Karen found herself walking through the neighborhood, hoping to stumble upon Marcus and Emily. She wasn't entirely sure what she would say, but she knew she had to try. Her search led her past the local library, where she noticed a familiar car parked outside. It was Marcus's. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and went inside. The library was quiet, the faint hum of conversation and the rustle of pages filling the air. Karen spotted them near the children's section. Emily was seated at a small table, coloring in a book, while Marcus stood nearby, thumbing through a picture book. He looked relaxed, his guard down for the first time since the incident. Karen approached cautiously, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked up, his expression hardening as he recognized her. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cold but controlled. Karen faltered, her carefully rehearsed words evaporating under his gaze. I wanted to apologize," she said finally, "for what happened yesterday. I realize now that I overstepped, and I'm sorry." Marcus studied her for a moment, his jaw tight. "You didn't just overstep," he said, his voice low but firm. "You humiliated me in front of my daughter. You made her question our relationship, our family. Do you have any idea how much damage that kind of assumption can do?" Karen swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong. I let my own biases cloud my judgment." Emily looked up from her coloring, her eyes darting between her father and Karen. "Daddy, who is she?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Just someone I met yesterday, sweetheart," he said gently. "Go ahead and keep coloring." Karen glanced at Emily, her heart aching at the sight of the little girl's innocence. "I'd like to make it up to you," she said, addressing Marcus again. "If there's anything I can do—" Marcus shook his head, his expression guarded. "This isn't something you can just fix with an apology or a favor. It's bigger than that." Karen nodded, her face flushed with shame. "I understand," she said quietly, "but if you ever change your mind—" Marcus didn't respond, and Karen took that as her cue to leave. She walked out of the library, her chest tight with regret. She had hoped to make things right, but she realized now that some wounds weren't so easily healed. As Karen disappeared from view, Marcus sat down beside Emily, watching her color with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't change Karen's mind, or the minds of people like her, overnight, but he could make sure Emily grew up knowing her worth, regardless of what anyone else thought. Later that evening, as Marcus prepared dinner, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Denise, the woman he'd spoken to earlier. She had attached a flyer for an upcoming community event focused on diversity and inclusion, along with a personal note encouraging him to share his story. Marcus read the email twice, his mind racing. Could this be the opportunity he needed to make a difference? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear: he couldn't stay silent. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus mulled over his next steps. He knew that whatever he decided to do, it would set the stage for what came next, for himself, for Emily, and for the community that had watched it all unfold. As Marcus stared at the email, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was unexpected, especially at this hour. He set his phone down and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. To his surprise, it wasn't a familiar face. It was a man in a suit, holding a clipboard. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a flicker of unease, but he opened the door cautiously. "Good evening," the man said, flashing a polite smile. "Are you Marcus Turner?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes. Can I help you?" The man's expression didn't change, but there was something calculated in his demeanor. "My name is James Carver. I work with the Department of Child Welfare. Do you mind if I come in? I'd like to ask you a few questions." Marcus's stomach dropped. He felt a wave of anger and fear rise up, but he kept his face calm. "Child welfare? Why? Is something wrong?" James glanced at the clipboard, avoiding direct eye contact. "We received an anonymous report expressing concerns about your daughter's well-being. It's routine for us to follow up on these matters." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't need to guess who had made the call. His thoughts immediately went to Karen. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. "Emily is fine. She's asleep right now. I don't appreciate someone questioning my ability to take care of my child." James gave a small nod, as if he'd expected the resistance. "I understand how this might feel invasive, Mr. Turner, but I assure you, we're just here to ensure Emily is in a safe and supportive environment." Marcus stepped aside, his mind racing. He led James to the living room, gesturing for him to sit. The man's presence felt like an intrusion, but Marcus knew that refusing cooperation could make things worse. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but clipped. James shook his head. "No, thank you. I won't take up too much of your time." He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the shelves lined with books and the scattered toys on the floor. Everything in Marcus's home spoke of a life built around love and care for his daughter. but Marcus could see James mentally cataloguing
James
every
finally
detail.
looked up
From his clipboard. "How long have you been Emily's guardian?" "I've been her father since the day she was born," Marcus replied, his tone firm. "She's my biological daughter." James nodded, scribbling something on his clipboard. "And her mother?" "She passed away when Emily was a baby," Marcus said, the familiar pang of loss resurfacing. He hated how clinical the question felt, as though his family history was just another box to check. James didn't react, simply jotting down more notes. "I see. And how would you describe your relationship with Emily?" Marcus felt his patience wearing thin. "She's my whole world," he said, his voice laced with emotion. "I've done everything to make sure she's happy, healthy, and loved. Anyone who knows us can tell you that." James seemed to consider this, his expression unreadable. "Do you mind if I take a quick look around the house? Again, it's just part of the process." Marcus hesitated, but nodded. He watched as James walked through the house, opening doors and glancing into rooms. It felt invasive, but Marcus stayed silent, knowing any sign of resistance could be misinterpreted. When James returned to the living room, he sat back down, flipping through his notes. "Everything seems to be in order," he said finally, though his tone offered little reassurance. "I'll include that in my report. For now, there's nothing further, but we'll be in touch if we have any additional questions." Marcus exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. "Thank you for your time," he said, though the words felt forced. He showed James to the door, closing it firmly behind him. The moment James was gone, Marcus sank onto the couch, his hands trembling. He felt violated, angry, and powerless all at once. Someone had taken their assumptions and weaponized them, bringing his ability to parent into question. He glanced at the hallway, where Emily's room was, and his resolve hardened. He couldn't let this go unanswered. The following day, Marcus met with Denise at the advocacy group's office. As he recounted the visit from child welfare, she listened intently, her face a mixture of understanding and outrage. "This isn't just about bias," she said when he finished. "It's about systemic issues that allow these kinds of accusations to spiral out of control. We need to get ahead of this." Marcus nodded, though he felt the weight of the task ahead. "What do we do?" "We make noise," Denise said firmly. "We bring your story to light. The more people know about what happened, the harder it will be for anyone to question your integrity as a father." But even as Marcus began to formulate a plan with Denise, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Somewhere, out there, Karen, or someone like her, still believed they had done the right thing. And now that belief had escalated into a full-blown investigation, one that could threaten the life he had built for Emily. That evening, Marcus sat with Emily, helping her with a new puzzle she had picked out at the library. Her laughter filled the room, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. But as he watched her, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for her future, for the world he wanted her to grow up in. The stakes had never felt higher, and Marcus knew the road ahead would only get tougher. But he was ready to face whatever came next, even as the shadow of the conflict loomed larger than ever. Marcus spent the next week preparing to attend the diversity and inclusion event Denise had invited him to. With her encouragement, he decided to speak about his experience, not just to share his story, but to challenge the assumptions that had caused so much pain. The idea of standing in front of a crowd made him anxious, but he knew this was bigger than his fears. Emily deserved to grow up in a world where families like theirs weren't scrutinized or questioned. On the day of the event, Marcus arrived early, holding Emily's hand tightly. The auditorium buzzed with energy as people from all walks of life gathered to celebrate their community's diversity. Emily, dressed in her favorite bright yellow dress, clung to her father's side, her wide eyes taking in the colorful displays and posters lining the walls. Denise greeted them at the door, her warm smile calming Marcus's nerves. "You're going to do great," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "Just speak from the heart." As the event began, Marcus sat quietly in the audience with Emily on his lap, listening to the stories of other speakers. Each one was a powerful reminder of the challenges and triumphs of living authentically in a world that often demanded conformity. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus took a deep breath, stood up, and made his way to the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. He started by introducing himself and Emily, sharing a bit about their family and the love they shared. Then he dove into the events of the past few weeks, the incident at the park, the visit from child welfare, and the lasting impact of prejudice disguised as concern. His voice shook at times, but he spoke with conviction, his words resonating deeply with the audience. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Marcus glanced down at Emily, who was beaming up at him, and felt a surge of pride. He had done it not just for himself, but for her and for every family that had faced similar challenges. But as Marcus stepped off the stage, the unexpected twist arrived. Karen was in the audience. She stood near the back of the room, her face pale but resolute. Marcus spotted her as he returned to his seat, his expression tightening. He hadn't seen or heard from her since the day she showed up at the library, and her presence now felt both intrusive and baffling. Why was she here? Before Marcus could process what was happening, Karen approached him. Her posture was hesitant, and she carried a small envelope in her hands. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the chatter in the room. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" Emily clung to Marcus's leg, her earlier excitement now replaced with uncertainty. Marcus took a deep breath, crouching down to Emily's level. "Why don't you go see Denise for a few minutes, sweetheart? I'll be right here." Emily nodded reluctantly, and Denise, noticing the exchange, guided her away with a reassuring smile. Once they were out of earshot, Marcus turned to Karen, his arms crossed. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone guarded. Karen hesitated, holding out the envelope. "I owe you an explanation," she said, "and an apology." Marcus didn't take the envelope right away. He studied her, searching for any sign of sincerity. "I don't think anything you say can undo what you've already done," he said flatly. "I know," Karen admitted, her voice breaking. I wanted you to understand why I reacted the way I did. Not to excuse it. There's no excuse for what I did, but to give you some context." Against his better judgment, Marcus took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, no older than Emily, with light brown hair and a wide, toothy grin. She stood beside a man whose skin tone matched Marcus's, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. "That's my daughter," Karen said softly. Her name was Rachel. Marcus's expression softened despite himself. "Was?" Karen's eyes filled with tears. "She died 3 years ago in a car accident. Her father, my ex-husband, was driving. I lost both of them that day." Marcus felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly tempered by the memory of what she had put him and Emily through. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice careful. "But I don't see how that justifies what you did." "It doesn't," Karen said quickly. "But when I saw you and Emily at the park, it brought back so many memories. I thought I was protecting her, but I realize now that I let my grief and my biases cloud my judgment. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I've been carrying so much guilt since that day." Marcus studied her, torn between anger and understanding. "You've caused so much harm," he said finally. "Not just to me, but to Emily. She's just a little girl, and you made her question her family, her place in the world. That's not something she'll forget." Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth." Marcus didn't respond right away. He glanced toward Emily, who was laughing with Denise, blissfully unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. When he turned back to Karen, his expression was resolute. "I appreciate the explanation," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But your actions still have consequences. If you really want to make amends, use this as a lesson. Speak out against the kind of assumptions you made about me. Help other people see the harm it causes. That's the only way you can truly make things right." Karen nodded, her shoulders sagging with the weight of his words. "I will," she promised. "Thank you for hearing me out." As she walked away, Marcus felt a sense of closure, not just for himself, but for Emily. The truth had come to light, and while it didn't erase the pain, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He would continue to fight for his daughter, for their family, and for the world he wanted her to grow up in. A world where love, not fear or prejudice, defined their story.